Welcome to Canada West Forum. Canada West Forum is a nonprofit, citizen-led organization dedicated to informed, nonpartisan civil dialogue. It convenes public forums with expert guests to encourage thoughtful, in-depth discussions and the open exchange of ideas. Our forum today deals with wealth inequality. How did it get so extreme, and what can we do about it? Surprisingly, this issue doesn't receive the attention it deserves. My name is Pat McCutcheon, and I'll be your host for this event. Joining us today are Alex Hemingway. Alex is a senior economist with BC Policy Solutions. Among other things, Alex's research focuses on public finances, housing, inequality, taxation policy, and tax fairness. We also have Silas Xuereb. Silas is an economist and policy analyst with Canadians for Tax Fairness. Silas has years of experience in academia and working with nonprofit organizations. Also here today is Emma Davis. Emma is a board member with Patriotic Millionaires Canada. Emma spent her career working in nonprofit administration and the arts. Her household wealth began to change dramatically when her husband sold his software startup. Now she's finding ways to use her privilege to ensure a more equitable and sustainable society. Our discussion today will explore the history and causes of wealth inequality, the societal consequences associated with wealth inequality, tax advantages that favor the wealthy, and actions we can take to build a more equitable society. So with that, we will get into the first segment of the presentation, which is a short history of how government policy has led to accelerating wealth inequality. And I'm going to bring Alex Hemingway from BC Policy Solutions in for that.
Thanks,
Take it
Matt.
away.
All right, folks, just give me a second. I'm going to share my screen here. Got some slides. Okay. Well, it's good to be here with folks today, discussing, this issue, I think, that looms over our society of wealth inequality. And thanks to Pat for inviting me to join this panel. As Pat mentioned, I'm with BC Policy Solutions. For those who aren't familiar with it, we're a new public policy research institute launched actually exactly a year ago today by the people who were involved with the BC office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which is where I worked previously for nearly a decade. So if you're interested in issues like wealth inequality, interested in the type of research and analysis that we do, I would invite you to check us out at bcpolicy.ca. There's a mailing list you can join. And the final thing I'll just say is, for those who are in BC, we'll also be hosting a webinar next week analyzing the BC provincial budget, which will be announced next week and is looking like it's going to be an austerity budget. And you can find the info for that webinar at bcpolicy.ca/events. So what I'm going to do is just try and set some context for this conversation. I'll talk a little bit about the state of wealth inequality in Canada today, its trajectory over time. I'll distinguish between what I see as two different but important facets of wealth inequality in Canada and touch on some of the explanations for the rise of top-end wealth inequality in recent decades. And I'm going to do this in less than 15 minutes, then we'll get to a more conversational component. So just off the top, let me define terms here. When we talk about wealth, what do we mean? I'm talking about net worth. So the market value of everything someone owns minus all their debts. So that would include assets like real estate, bank accounts, businesses, stocks, bonds. On the asset side, mortgages, credit card debt, other lines of credit, so on, any debt on the liability side. And in total, Canadian households owned about $18.4 trillion in net wealth in the third quarter of 2025. But of course, that is not wealth that's distributed very evenly. Now, there are different indicators of wealth inequality, different ways you can measure it. One of them is to divide households into groupings of 20% by wealth, and that's what I'm showing in the chart here. And as you can see on the far right, the richest 20% of households in Canada hold nearly two-thirds of the total wealth. The next 20% holds a decent chunk, basically proportional to its share of households, a little more than 20% of wealth. And then the bottom three groupings hold collectively very little of the national wealth share. Now, this is useful looking in quintile terms, and it's the most readily available measure of wealth inequality in Canada. So Statistics Canada updates these figures now 4 times a year. But looking only at these 20% groupings hides the vast amounts of wealth that are concentrated at the very top of the distribution among billionaires and among multimillionaires in the wealthiest 1%. And unfortunately, Statistics Canada data isn't great at tracking wealth concentration at this level. There's no regular data being released for these extreme forms of wealth inequality. They have taken some steps forward at StatsCan, some initial tentative steps into this area. Hopefully that's something we're going to see them build on. But we certainly do want to understand wealth at the very top, given the extraordinary level of economic resources held by these relatively few individuals and the power that confers over our economy and society. And so actually one of our windows into wealth at the top, one of the most important ones, believe it or not, comes from rich lists in magazines like Forbes and Maclean's. Previously Canadian Business used to track very rich households in Canada. I think that would surprise many people that that's the state of our data, but there it is. To put one number on it, 86 Canadian resident billionaire families collectively held $286 billion of wealth in 2023, or as much as the bottom 6.2 million Canadians combined. This figure comes from modeling that Silas and I, and you'll hear from Silas later from Canadians for Tax Fairness, did in a forthcoming report. It's actually coming out next week. That estimate is actually conservative for reasons I won't get into right now, but you could read about in our report or we can talk about later. But you can come up with slightly different ways of measuring billionaire wealth in Canada, depending on whether you focus on residency or citizenship, whether you use Forbes or Maclean's. Now, here's actually a bit more of a sneak preview of that upcoming report. And what Silas and I did was combine the rich list data from Forbes with Statistics Canada survey data and do a bit of fancy econometrics footwork to model the top end of the wealth distribution more broadly over the past quarter century in Canada and try and help fill that data gap that I mentioned earlier. And to do that, we adapted a methodology used by the Parliamentary Budget Office, which is one of the other outfits in the country that has, helped fill that data gap in recent years. And what we found is that over the past quarter century, there's been a significant rise in the concentration of wealth in the top 1% in Canada. The top 1% controlled a little under a quarter of the country's wealth, 1% of people alone. And things get even more extreme as you move further up the distribution. So, for example, the average member of the top 0.01% held 4,000 times more wealth on average than an average family in the bottom 50%. That's another way of looking at this. We do find a slight decline in top wealth shares since 2016, but still a substantial overall increase over the full quarter century. And these findings are broadly consistent with a slightly older study by academic economists that estimated a longer run wealth inequality trends in Canada. They found that top 1% wealth shares in Canada had actually decreased after the Second World War through the 1960s. And I'll come back a little in a few minutes to some reasons why that might be. And then our rise in wealth inequality starting from around the 1970s through the 2010s. So, going back 50 plus years, we've been through a period of a very substantial increase in top end wealth inequality in the country. And although we're focused on wealth inequality here, Pat did ask me to just give a bit of a window on income inequality at the top as well. Obviously, they relate. And there's better data for income inequality. And you can see in the figure here, looking at the top 1% of incomes, there's a broadly similar pattern. There was a noticeable decline in income inequality around the Second World War that lasted for a few decades and then began to reverse and shoot back up again in the 1980s. This chart is showing both that pattern in the US and in Canada, a little more attenuated in Canada, but still very significant. And, this is the type of chart, this U-shaped chart that, economists like Thomas Piketty are famous for, and his collaborators. I'll give a quick look here at more recent research by Silas and his co-authors in a recent paper, which finds similarly that increase in income inequality from the 1980s until the early 2010s, and then looking like kind of a plateau on income inequality since then. Now, coming back to wealth, there's a distinction I want to make here. I think our focus in this session is likely to be on the very highest end of inequality, billionaires, top 1%, and rightly so. But there's another dimension of wealth inequality in Canada that I think can't be ignored, and that relates to land and housing wealth. And if you look, so the net wealth held by all homeowners, in just owner-occupiers in their principal residences in Canada, was $5.8 trillion in 2023. So that's net of any mortgage debt, property value minus mortgage debt, just among owner-occupiers. So it's a very significant portion of the national wealth is in that owner-occupier real estate. And this is especially concentrated, though, in the most expensive, unaffordable cities in the country, like Vancouver and Toronto. In the greater Vancouver area, the value of the land alone, not the buildings on top of it, just land under detached single-family houses, was worth $744 billion in 2024, which actually dwarfs the total wealth of Canadian billionaires. Obviously, it's spread more widely, but it's a very significant amount of aggregate wealth. And you can look at the quintile distribution here too and see that even principal residence net worth, which we might think of as one of the more equally distributed components of wealth, is highly concentrated in the richest 20%. Again, more spread out than billionaire wealth, but enormous in aggregate, highly unequal, and has huge effects on life opportunity, particularly in our biggest cities. And so, shouldn't be ignored in discussions of wealth inequality. And this is meant to wrap up this element of the discussion. This has meant a huge wealth gap between renters and homeowners in Canada that's emerged in recent decades. So in 2023, homeowners held as much as 10 to 30 times more wealth than renters within a given age group. And I'm showing that from a Globe and Mail chart here based on StatsCan data. And this is a topic for another day, I think, but it's worth noting that those huge increases in land value, land wealth we've seen in the country are, fundamentally unearned form of capital gain, because land value is location-based. It's created collectively. It's essentially the result of urban land value is a reflection of what makes a place useful and attractive to people. Driven by things like public investment and infrastructure that we all contribute to, as well as just the thriving economic and social activity of the city. So none of that's attributable to a landowner, but actually the wealth that's associated with it is highly concentrated. Now, just a few words on how we got to where we are today. As I mentioned earlier, there was a period starting around the Second World War. We saw a substantial reduction in top-end wealth inequality, the top 1% wealth share, followed by that increase again over the past 4 or 5 decades. It's always difficult to definitively tease out cause and effect, but this rise of top-end inequality corresponded essentially to the neoliberal turn in public policy in Canada. Policies like tax cuts for those at the very top, uh, policies like opening up international capital flows and unregulating them, uh, phenomenon like attacks on unions, both in the US and Canada, and declines in unionization rates, uh, the rise of investor rights agreements that masquerade as free trade agreements that tend to empower capital over workers, privatization of public services, this whole suite of policy changes that, is often associated with, Reagan in the US, Thatcher in Britain. And of course, we saw our big federal social spending cuts in Canada a little bit later in the 1990s, but some of these policy trends originating earlier than that. And you can also trace things back on that second dimension of inequality, the housing-driven dimension. We've been through a period where there's been, for decades, significant underinvestment in social housing, severe underbuilding of housing supply overall, including on the market side, the rise of exclusionary zoning policies, very large subsidies to home ownership that have really privileged home ownership over renting and homeowners over renters. So I'm going to leave it there and pass it back to Pat. But yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion and the other presentations. So thanks for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. I think you did a wonderful job of laying out how wealth inequality has developed, over the past century. One thing that I think needs to be stated is that wealth inequality is not a universal natural law. We have demonstrated in the past that we can narrow that gap. We can be a more productive society. We can build a better civilization. But like you mentioned, we at the turn, when Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher came in, that's when the inequality seemed to accelerate again. And but there's no reason why we can't sort of turn the corner, develop policy to reverse this wealth inequality gap. The trend right now seems to be going in the wrong direction, though. It's still, would you say that's true, Alex?
Well, it's an interesting question. In this report that we're going to have out next week with Silas and Canadians for Tax Fairness, we do, and we're not the only ones who have documented this. There does seem to be a little bit of a short-term dip in how extreme that top-end inequality has got. It's an interesting question. It can't necessarily go up forever as a share, but we have no confidence that dip is going to continue. And one reason for that is, it may be associated with, it actually relates back to the housing question as well, because although that housing wealth is very unequally held, it is much more broadly held than the top 1%. And we saw, big run up in housing prices, especially post pandemic in sort of the first couple of years after the pandemic, which may actually erode that 1% or billionaire wealth share a little bit, because that very top end wealth tends to be held financially. There's plenty of real estate wealth out there too, but it's disproportionately financial wealth at the top. So if the middle is gained a little bit of ground, at least in these aggregate statistics, I think it doesn't feel like it for most people. It may be to do with those trends in housing prices, but we know, our data set came up to 2023, and since then, housing prices have been relatively flat, whereas the stock market has taken off again. So I think we wouldn't be surprised if, when additional data becomes available, we're able to update those estimates that actually that dip has either flattened out or reversed.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think you're right there. You made a lot of points there. One other thing that you touched on too was the income inequality, and this is an area where uh, the worker productivity has not, or the increase in worker productivity has not been rewarded with their wage gains, whereas at the higher end, the executives of these companies, we've seen their pay packages just explode, and in a sense, the workers have not been benefiting as much as the executives have on the productivity gains of larger companies.
Yeah, I think there's no I mean, everyone feels that disconnect between what's happening for working people and those at the very top. And, and there's a lot going on there. I think we'll get into this more later in the conversation in terms of tax policies and what can be done. But we have some very unfair tax policies in this country, one of which is income that's gotten from capital gains, from essentially from owning capital and growing your wealth is taxed. Only half of it is taxed, whereas income from work, the whole of it is taxed.
Yeah,
It's the capital gains inclusion rate. So that's, yeah, one element of the
yeah,
equation here.
yeah. No, that is an area that we definitely want to get into later on in the conversation. And okay, we'll leave that. Thanks very much, Alex. Yeah, we're going to move on to the next section of our presentation today, and this will deal with the societal consequences of wealth inequality. I think there's a big disconnect between the public and the consequences that result from extreme wealth inequality. And so this is the reason why I wanted to bring this topic into the conversation. And and this is open to all of our panelists here. Maybe Emma, maybe we'll start with you. Can you, do you want to give us sort of an opening statement here on maybe what some of the consequences are when it comes to extreme wealth inequality? Sorry, I didn't give
Um,
you a heads up on this.
that's fine, Pat. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here, joining you from the traditional territories of the Hul'qumi'num speaking people in what is now known as Galiano, between Vancouver and Victoria. I am no expert in the social consequences of wealth inequality. I mean, I think Silas and Alex may well want to jump in here and speak to this. I can speak to um, what I see as an individual in Canada and what moves me and what I care about. And I think maybe it would make sense to speak a little bit more generally about what the data shows are the consequences and the links between, um, social inequality and social determinants of health. Um, what I observe, what I notice and care about is some of the research that comes from Wilkinson and Pickett's in the spirit level, which is something some folks may be familiar with, and some surprising findings around the impacts of socioeconomic disparity. When we look at a kind of international level of nations that have significant rates of inequality, we see that there's a correlation between wide inequality and health and social problems. So everything from life expectancy, obesity, infant mortality rates to things like literacy and social mobility and levels of addiction, societal distrust. These things all go up as inequality goes up. And this also applies to things like metrics of happiness. And the thing that I find especially interesting about this, and we can maybe speak a little bit more about this later, is that this happens to everyone across the income ladder. So societies with these kinds of problems are worse places to live, not just for the people who are at the lower end of the income ladder, but also for folks who have wealth. The wealth doesn't protect them from the impacts because these are not problems of poverty, they are problems of inequality. And I think that's something that's really important to remember when we're talking about this.
Yeah. There's no question that that when we build this inequality, that quite often the social services, such as healthcare, education, suffer because of this. The revenue just isn't there. For the government to provide strong healthcare, strong education, strong infrastructure, that sort of thing. Um, and Yeah, if we can balance out or if we can distribute wealth more equitably, then we can build a stronger foundation um, within our society. So yeah, it has a lot of consequences. Some of the other things that we get into as well is, and not just the social programs, but quite often the wealthy are busy buying up real estate, which drives up the housing costs for the general population. Uh, there's an awful lot of consolidation of businesses that go on. You take corporations in Canada like Loblaws and like Rogers. These corporations across Canada, they've been consolidating their businesses across the country, and that of course reduces competition, driving up prices for the consumers. Uh, you you also see a lot of corporations or a lot of individuals buying up media companies and sort of controlling the narrative that that the public sees. For instance, the Thompson family owns the Globe and Mail. I don't know how much the influence, the editorial in that paper, but we certainly see uh, examples of this more down in the States, where the Murdoch family owns Fox News and controls the narrative there quite a bit. And this has an impact on the population as far as the information that they're receiving. In a lot of cases, think tanks are also controlled by the wealthy in our country, and they are being sort of pushed to promote a particular narrative when it comes to taxation on the wealthy. We see that quite well. We see that locally here with the Fraser Institute, but down south, we see it with the Heritage Institution and some other main institutions down there. There's other examples of this as well when it comes to education. Quite often, wealthy people are donating to various universities, and their donations quite often come with strings attached, where they will uh, encourage the university to promote a certain business model. So yeah, there is an awful lot of consequential uh, results that come out of this because the wealthy have the means at their disposal to
Yeah,
shape. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just jump in, Pat. I think this is something that many people are familiar with on a local level. We see it play out in our town halls across the country, where you might have a affordable housing project that comes up for rezoning, and NIMBYs who are in opposition have the time and the resources to amplify their message above the voices of the majority. I think that's something that we see at a much grander scale as well. And Alex mentioned the capital gains inclusion rate. I think the proposal from the Liberals to increase that rate just before the last election is a great example of the same thing happening, where a very small handful of wealthy people fear-mongered about the plan and created a narrative that it was going to stifle innovation and cause capital flight, even though the policy was very narrowly targeted at you know, creating more tax benefits for Canadian innovators. But what happened is the loudest voices were the rich people who wanted to keep growing their wealth and didn't care about what happened to the country.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, that was a frustrating moment for me. I know when Mark Carney decided to scrap the that initiative on increasing the inclusion rate on capital gains. But yeah, that's what yeah, that happened. I think that was a little bit of a flag as well. I think to probably a lot of us that are concerned about wealth inequality, that was a flag from Mark Carney giving us a signal as to the direction that he wants to shape policy in Canada, and it's disappointing because I think we can build a much stronger Canada if we start to develop policy that supports the majority of the citizens, not just the wealthy. Um, Anybody else have anything that they'd like to add to this, Alex or Silas?
I can jump in on the consequences and thanks for having me, Pat. Um, yeah, I think and not to get, too hyperbolic here, but I do think it's tough to have this conversation right now without considering what's happening in the States, right? And I don't think it's a coincidence that, authoritarianism, fascism, if you want to call it that, is rising in a country with some of the highest inequality in the world, right? And we see that the people who are leading this charge are the wealthiest people in America. It is the billionaires who are leading a lot of this, right? And so I don't think again that's a coincidence, right? And I think we need to think about wealth as being really, really closely connected to power, right? And so when we have this extreme concentration of wealth, we also have this extreme concentration of power. And when that happens, the people with that much power are going to be really, really willing to fight to try to avoid losing it, right? And I think that's what we're seeing in the States right now. So, I don't think Canada's, close to that right now, but I think it is important to think about, longer term where we want to go and the possible consequences of continuing down a path where wealth inequality continues to accelerate, and I don't like what that looks like. So I think we should get ahead of that and start tackling this problem as soon as we can.
Yeah, 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 for sure. Thank you for that, Silas. Yeah, I almost think that Donald Trump is a neoliberal endgame. Maybe I'm being a little bit extreme here, but it almost looks like this has been building for a while now, and the oligarchs south of the border are kind of seizing the opportunity to uh, kind of close the door on this and say, okay, we got all the chips, guys, and uh, you know that is unfortunately where this is possibly headed. Alex, have you got anything you'd like to add?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, great points made. The other thing I was thinking about putting in the mix is, you do sometimes hear the argument made that along the lines that inequality is the price we have to pay for economic growth. And that's just not what the evidence tells us. And, we outline some of this in our report that's coming up. There's a whole range of research that finds that high levels of inequality actually tend to lower economic growth and productivity, make it less stable, less durable. There's less aggregate demand because lower income households have less money at their disposal to spend. And then, and I think you maybe touched on this earlier, Pat, but the other consequence of that high inequality and keeping taxes low for the rich is that we're depriving our governments, our public sectors of the revenue they need to make really important investments that matter to people's lives, but also matter to keeping the social fabric together, whether that's housing, healthcare, childcare, but not to mention, doing something about our heating planet that we're all going to bear the consequences of. But again, as usual, not evenly.
Right, right. No, no, well, that was great. That was a great summary of the consequences. I think we were able to sort of spotlight a lot of the issues. Yeah, we're going to move on now to chat with Emma here about, believe it or not, there are some wealthy individuals out there that care about the accelerating issue on wealth inequality, and they want to do something about it. They want to be taxed more. But just before we get going, I'd just like to share with you a quote from Billie Eilish. She was at an award ceremony back in October last year, and it turns out that Mark Zuckerberg and his wife were also in the audience. And anyways, when she was up on the stage, she was being presented the award, and she was giving her speech. Part of what she said was, "If you're a billionaire, why are you a billionaire? No hate, but yeah, give your money away, shorties." And that kind of stuck with me. That Billie Eilish is a bit of an advocate out there. She also took the opportunity at the Grammys on the weekend for some other issues that are important to her. But Mark Zuckerberg didn't like that comment. He sat there quietly while the audience applauded. But but anyways, yeah. So Emma, what influenced you to swim against the tide on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the situation I was describing earlier and the sort of social impact of inequality on society, I think we are fundamentally social creatures, and the health of our collective affects all of us as individuals. So I have kind of some selfish answers to your question and some less selfish answers. I look at this kind of hypothetical unequal society, and I see the rich person struggling as these various health and social indicators are diminishing for them personally, and it doesn't hold a lot of appeal to me. And I also want to live in a society where my fellow citizen has a social safety net. You know, a country that where I go to the doctor and I can trust that that person has had a top quality education. When I ride public transit and I know that my fellow rider has access to healthcare during a pandemic. The alternative is hiding in a gated community in fear and isolation, and that holds no appeal to me. So I want my fellow citizen to be secure because that benefits me. That's the selfish piece. But I also want my fellow citizen, to be secure because I believe that every human being deserves to have their needs met. And I don't want to keep a slightly larger portion of the returns on my investments while my neighbors suffer. I want to contribute to a society that values compassion. I also think that it's important to consider the democratic foundation of tax distribution. Just from a philosophical perspective, I'm not just a rich person, I'm also a feminist, an environmentalist, a childcare advocate. Rich people have many intersecting identities, and democracy is the best system for protecting individual rights in general. So I want to see the resources go into a system where most citizens have a voice about how those resources are going to be spent.
Yeah, no, you made a lot of great points there. I mean, I share your passion for making sure that we have strong resources available to all of our citizens. It's not based on your bank account, and that's where we have to get to. Right now, we're seeing a lot of those support systems crumbling, and that frustrates me.
Yeah, so you're
Go
Sorry,
ahead.
go ahead, Pat. Yeah, I was just going to say, you're asking, how did I get here? And I think maybe it's helpful to give a little bit of context. I maybe will start by just saying this is an inherently awkward conversation. Talking about personal finances is taboo in our society. And I come to this conversation shaped by the way that I was raised. My parents were both artists. My dad was super involved in the anti-apartheid movement. And our dinner table conversations were all about social justice and human rights and equity and democracy. So when my family wealth situation changed, when my husband sold his software startup, and that kind of began a real shift in our financial situation, it didn't change my belief that there's a level of wealth that's too much and is damaging in all the ways that we've been talking about today. It's also, for me, when I look at my personal situation, it's very clear that no one in this country builds wealth alone. We would not have achieved this level of wealth without public investment in our housing, our healthcare, our education, having access to infrastructure, transportation. So it's very to me, it's very clear that people like me who have benefited the most from these public investments should be contributing a fairer share, and I would be proud to pay higher taxes. Progressive taxation allows us to redistribute the resources that wealthy people are hoarding and to reduce their wealth and thus their disproportionate power. And so I see it as a twofer.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you make some great points there. It's, I think our society can be a lot stronger if we do a better job of the redistribution. Um, do you think there's much support within the wealthy for the kind of advocacy that you're promoting, and that the Patriotic Millionaire Canada Society is promoting?
Yeah, I mean, I think that taboo that I referenced earlier kind of gets in the way because I think that there's a public perception around how wealthy people think about wealth and taxation. But there was a new poll that just came out last month from Survation, and they surveyed millionaires in G20 countries, roughly 4,000 people, 200 of them were Canadian. 65% of the millionaires polled support higher taxes on the very richest to invest in public services and tackle the cost of living crisis, all the issues we've been discussing. Only 17% of the people polled were opposed. And of the Canadians that were surveyed, 61% support 2% wealth tax on multimillionaire and billionaire wealth. So it's a very small minority of the super rich that are fixated on amassing and protecting their fortunes. The majority of us know that equitable taxation benefits society as a whole.
Yeah. Quite often. Quite often the issue of philanthropy comes up, and that argument gets tossed out there. Well, I give all kinds of money away to this society or that society, and that should be good enough. What do you have to say to that argument?
I've spent most of my career working in the nonprofit sector. I've had the opportunity to observe some of the kind of underbelly of philanthropy close up. And I guess I come away from that with a sense that there is a disconnect between the lived experience of most philanthropists and the average Canadian. Philanthropy is very susceptible to the whims of wealthy individuals, to the things that they are interested in supporting. I happen to be a really big fan of site-specific theater and circus. And if it were entirely up to me to determine where my excess wealth was going to be distributed, a very significant portion of it would probably go in that direction. I think supporting the arts is really important, but I'm not sure that my, personal preferences are the right way to make those decisions about the wealth that I have that is available for redistribution. And every dollar that's spent philanthropically is a dollar that isn't democratically spent.
Well,
I do think I think there are things that charity deals with well, but
that's it, isn't
issue.
it? It takes a democracy out of the equation. You hit the nail on the head when you say, well, it's at the whim of what I particularly want to support and when I want to support it. And then you also don't have the scale likely to really build the program that is needed to support the population of your country. So I'm, as usual, I'm a bad time manager here, but can you give me a short, 30 second, 60 second, 90 second, 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute, 4 minute, 5 minute, 6 minute, 7 minute, 8 minute, 9 minute, 10 minute, 11 minute, 12 minute, 13 minute, 14 minute, 15 minute, 16 minute, 17 minute, 18 minute, 19 minute, 20 minute, 21 minute, 22 minute, 23 minute, 24 minute, 25 minute, 26 minute, 27 minute, 28 minute, 29 minute, 30 minute, 31 minute, 32 minute, 33 minute, 34 minute, 35 minute, 36 minute, 37 minute, 38 minute, 39 minute, 40 minute, 41 minute, 42 minute, 43 minute, 44 minute, 45 minute, 46 minute, 47 minute, 48 minute, 49 minute, 50 minute, 51 minute, 52 minute, 53 minute, 54 minute, 55 minute, 56 minute, 57 minute, 58 minute, 59 minute, 60 minute, concentrated answer to how the tax code maybe favors people in your situation? I'm sorry, I got to rush you here.
Yeah, no, I think I can do that concisely. That's fine. There's lots of ways that the tax code is designed to protect people like me. Most of my income comes through my investments. So exactly as Alex was mentioning earlier, the capital gains inclusion rate means that it's half the tax rate that is applied to folks who earn their money through a paycheck. That's one. That's probably the biggest one as far as I'm concerned. But I think the other piece that really stands out for me is the way taxation is tiered in Canada. The top tax rate starts at 250,000 roughly in income. Correct me if I'm wrong, Alex and Silas, but that's my understanding. And so someone who's making that much money a year and someone who's making millions of dollars a year are taxed at the same rate. And I see that as a real, just a real opportunity to level the playing field a bit more. Yeah, so that would be the short answer, Pat.
Yeah. No, okay. Yeah, I mean, just one final comment on this segment here. The United States is burning to the ground. And while that is going on, the wealthy elite, the captains of industry, are not pushing back and stepping up. I find this very disturbing, and I don't know if it's got a self-interest component to it or what, but when you look at the United States, like I said, it's burning to the ground, and yet our corporate and our residential leaders are just kind of sitting on their hands and staying silent. And with that, I don't know. Do you have anything that you want to say to that statement, Emma, or should we just move on here?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear from Silas and Alex as well if they have anything to add to that. I really want to acknowledge I'm not an expert in this field. I'm just a person who could speak to my personal experience. So.
Yeah. No. Okay, Silas, are you jumping in here, or are you okay?
Sure. I mean, I think as you said, I think there's definitely an element of self-interest in it, right? And I mean, since coming into power, the Trump administration has done an excellent job defending the interests of the ultra wealthy, right? The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was his signature policy move in the first administration, and I think captains of industry, as you said, are very far removed from the ice on the streets that are terrifying a lot of people in the U.S. today, right? So they're not facing those consequences directly, and they're benefiting from a lot of Trump's policies. So yeah, I don't think they have a lot of interest in fighting back right now.
Okay, well, we'll move. We'll move on to the next segment. We're going to attempt to lay out some solutions to this wealth inequality issue. And Silas, this is where we're going to bring you in. And we talked on the phone about a week and a half ago. The first step, I think, in this conversation needs to be on what the final goal looks like. If we're going to try to come up with some solutions for wealth inequality, for solving wealth inequality, we kind of need to know what the game plan is. What are the goals? What do we want to achieve with this? And I mean, I've got a couple of things here that seem important to me. We need a tax code that is equally applied. We need a tax code that is supportive of the workforce and the businesses that are actually the builders of our society. I mean, this to me is a really important aspect. In a lot of cases, the current tax code, as Emma laid out, it favors the accumulation of assets. In a lot of cases, those assets are not the builders of our society. They do not build businesses. They do not build homes. They do not heal the people that are sick. They don't educate our population. And so to me, I think our tax code needs to be supportive of the actual builders of our society. I know you've written previously about offshore tax havens. We got to take that into consideration. We also, I think we need to generate a new corporate culture that balances community support with shareholder returns. Right now, there's a strong bias within our corporate world um, to maximize shareholder returns, and I would love to see a culture that shifts more towards supporting the community that the businesses exist in and the workers that they employ. Those are a couple of things that seem to be important to me that we would need to include in any sort of solution. Have you got anything you'd like to add to that, Silas?
Sure. I mean, just starting on the big picture of what are we trying to achieve, right? I think, the big picture goal of, or of our society in general, and the tax system is just one part of that, right? Is a democratic society where small groups of people don't have enormous amounts of power over everyone else, right? Coming back to this link between wealth and power, right? And as you touched on earlier, that this power allows people to control media, allows people to have enormous influence over policy through just threatening to leave, right? Threatening jobs, but if they close down a plant or something like that, right? That's a huge amount of power to be concentrated in just a few people. So I think we want, my personal goal would be, to use the tax system to be part of shaping a society where power is more equally distributed, and where, yeah, as others were speaking to earlier, we have a real social safety net, and people aren't worried about putting food on the table or being able to afford a roof over their heads, right? So I think that's kind of the big picture that hopefully we're aiming for, and there's a lot of ways that we can use the tax code to help us move in that direction.
Okay, well, can you give me some examples? If you've got a magic wand, you're the Minister of Finance tomorrow. How would you reconfigure the tax code so that it's more equitable,
Yeah, so
or,
there's a few.
or that it would achieve the goals that we've sort of laid out here? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, we've already touched on the capital gains issue, right? So I'll just reiterate that one quickly, right? Currently, income that people make from owning things, from buying and selling assets, is taxed at half the rate of income from working, right? Which I think when it's put that way sounds really, ridiculous to most people, but that's the reality. That's how our tax system works right now, and these capital gains are incredibly concentrated among the richest Canadians. The richest 1.5% of Canadians earn over 60% of capital gains, right, in any given year, right? So this tax break is incredibly concentrated among the wealthy, and it encourages owning over working, right? Or we favor people who own assets rather than who work or build things, as you put it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And then,
Sorry. Can I just
yeah.
jump in here just with a couple of comments? I mean, yeah, you talk about owning assets, and a lot of these assets, they do not contribute at all to building our community. And um, I just like to I point out things like investing in crypto. If you're a crypto trader, if you're an options trader, if you're a futures trader, currency trader, a lot of these things uh, don't actually add any value at all to our society, but they are tax advantaged if you happen to be smart enough to achieve a capital gain on them. And I mean, I don't understand why our tax code favors them. I mean, that's that's maybe a conversation for another day, but I don't know why we do that. But anyway, sorry. I'll let you go there. You're the Minister of Finance. Take it away.
Sure, yeah. So in addition to that, we could implement a wealth tax, right? This is something that a lot of people are advocating for these days, and I think would go a long way to getting at to taxing wealth instead of work, right? Our income tax system, as we said, taxes working, and a wealth tax would tax what people own, right? And this, Alex has done some great work and calculations on this that, just wealth tax targeting people with at least $10 million in assets, right? So really targeting people who have a lot of assets, not just a primary $1 million home, rising to 2% and 3% above $100 million, would raise almost $40 billion a year, right? And it's only going to affect a very tiny portion of the population. And not only that, but these taxes are actually massively popular, right? As we're talking about democracy, right? Nearly 90% of Canadians support a wealth tax, right? And yet it's never on the political table, right? And we have to really think about why that is when we see polls that show such widespread support for it, right? And I think again, it's an indication of this really concentration of power, even if our political system is not purchased quite in the same way that the American system is, right? There's a lot of subtle ways of just, politicians deciding never to put that on the table because of the threats they might fear hearing from powerful people, right? If they put something like that on the table. And then lastly, or in addition, we could also crack down on the use of tax havens, right? So a lot of the issue with the wealth of the ultra wealthy is that it's never taxed as income in the first place, right? So wealthy people are able to accrue assets, are able to grow in value without being taxed by capital gains unless they sell their assets. It'll never be taxed, right? If they just hold on to it. And even if they do, pretty much every corporation these days, it's standard practice for corporations to have subsidiaries in low tax jurisdictions, in the Caribbean or in Europe, and these other jurisdictions that allow for secrecy and have incredibly low corporate tax rates, right? And most ultra wealthy people hold some sort of their assets in corporations, right? And yeah, our research just last year showed that Canadians have $682 billion of assets in 15 tiny tax havens. And this is more than Canadians hold in the entire rest of the world combined if we exclude the US. So UK, France, Australia, Japan, China, add up all of that, it's less than Canadians hold in tax havens, right? So it's clear that that the wealthy are using these tax jurisdictions solely to avoid taxes, right? There's no, real production reason why they would hold all these assets in these small countries that don't have very large domestic economies, right? And sometimes they push back and say, well, everyone has access to the laws, we play by the laws, and that's true, right? But most people will never have access to the type of tax planners that is required to set up these really complex structures, right? So we need to reform our laws to prevent the ultra wealthy and the large multinationals that they control from being able to set up these paper shell companies in tax havens that help them shield their assets from Canadian taxes, right? And I'll just one last idea to throw out there would be an inheritance tax, right? So Canada's the only G7 country without an inheritance tax, right? And we can see the consequences of that because the wealthiest families in Canada today, right? Like the Thompsons are the wealthiest family in Canada today. They were also the wealthiest family 25 years ago. And they were incredibly wealthy 50 years ago, right? We're on the third generation of ultra wealthy Thompsons right now. And that's partially because we have no inheritance tax. So they can just continually pass down that wealth generation after generation, right? So, and we can name the Westons, the Rogers, the Irvings, all of these are inherited family wealth, right? It's not just the generation that built these companies that is retaining these billions and billions of dollars of assets, right? So we really need to face the myth head on that Canada is a land of equal opportunity, right? No, some people inherit billions of dollars and some people inherit nothing, right? Like we do not have a land of equal opportunity. An inheritance tax would be one way to address that issue.
No, I'm glad you brought you brought that out for discussion because it's something that I've thought about for quite a while, but it seems to be a bit of a sacred cow, and pushing that one forward is going to require probably a lot of conversation, a lot of dialogue, and But like you said, there's a lot of other countries that are doing that, doing it successfully, and it helps to break down that intergenerational parade of wealth. So, anyways, we got to move on here. Yeah, there's more stuff there that I'd like to discuss, but thanks very much, Silas. So, so yeah, Silas has laid out some of the things that we can do with regards to, say, a wealth tax, an overhauled tax code. There's actually one more thing that we didn't discuss, and it has to do with something that was introduced recently by Wealth Inequality Panel, or no, it was. It has to do with introducing an international panel on inequality, similar to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that seems like a good step where where we bring governments from around the world together to discuss solutions to fighting wealth inequality. I don't know where we're at with that. Silas, do you have any information on where we're at in developing something of that nature, or is that still just in kind of the thought process stage?
As far as I know, it's still a proposal, hasn't been fully implemented yet. But yeah, it would be great if we could get some intergovernmental coordination to address this issue. And I just want to add that there's already avenues that these discussions are having taking place on the international stage, and in particular, actually right now in New York, there's discussions underway about a UN tax convention, which would be a democratically agreed to document that would set out some ground rules about taxation, hopefully including taxation of ultra high net worth individuals, that countries around the world could agree to. So definitely international coordination is an important part of this as well. And there's already steps being taken towards that. Although I'll add that Canada in particular has actually been resistant to this idea of a UN tax convention. So that's something that we also try to call out the government for kind of seems like they're trying to put the brakes on this potentially democratic way to tax the rich all around the world.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder why, but yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. So we'll move on to barriers, and I'll bring everybody in on this one. Uh, we've talked about a lot of solutions to building a better Canada, but it's obviously not as easy as it looks. There's a lot of barriers that are put up by, I guess, vested interests, that kind of thing, and we hear about the wealthy sort of building these barriers, the lobbying that goes on with government and so on and so forth. And I think that's very much true. I think they do have the ear of government officials that the average Canadian doesn't have. And it's more so in the States, of course, because the bigger the check that you can write, the more political influence you have. We fortunately scaled back political contributions to that, but that doesn't mean that the wealthy do not have access to expensive lobbyists. One of the arguments that we hear quite often, maybe you can speak to this, Emma, is that if we attempt to tax the wealthy more, they're all going to leave. And we recently had a new mayor elected in New York City, Zoran Mamdani, and the millionaires all said they were going to pack up and move. Does that happen?
I mean, it's such a bogeyman. I think the example that I've seen data for is out of Norway, which recently instituted a wealth tax. Yeah, there were some multimillionaires and some billionaires who left. Not enough to make the tax not worth it. There was still a net gain. I can only speak for myself as a person who has a certain amount of freedom and flexibility about where I want to live. what the tax rate is not how I decide where I want to be. I look at, in fact, we actually moved back to Canada from the US, and that decision was all about where were we going to raise our kids, where were they going to have access to a quality education and healthcare, and where were they going to feel safe, and where were we going to be finding people whose values we shared. And a lot of that safety net comes from places that have a high tax rate. So I think it's something that people say because they think that that threat is going to work, and I think we should just ignore it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think we've seen that play out. A lot of threats are leveled. I mean, we're seeing it right now in California. California has a referendum, I believe, on the books where there'd be a one-time 5% tax, and a lot of them are threatening to move to other states. But when the rubber hits the road, like you said, there's all of these other factors that come into deciding where you want to live, where you want to raise your family, where your friends are, where the social support is from an infrastructure point of view, healthcare, education, etc. So yeah, it isn't just about the tax rate; it's about so much more. So, anyways, maybe Alex and Silas, will corporate investment dry up? Is that something that is a real threat if if there's some taxation changes when it comes to corporations? Anybody want to take a stab at that? No?
Well, look, yeah, I think one thing that's nice about a wealth tax specifically is that it's taxing the stock of wealth. It's not taxing the act of investment. So, a wealth tax focused on the super rich would apply to the total stock of wealth that an individual or household holds, whether they hold investments in Canada or abroad, and it's getting easier to track some of those investments abroad. There's still big problems as Silas was talking about, but international efforts like the Common Reporting Standard means that it's getting more and more feasible by the year to track investments abroad. So a lot of this depends on the design of the tax itself. It should apply to worldwide holdings of wealthy families or individuals. So that's one benefit of that relative to the corporate tax. But I think there's plenty of room to take more action on the corporate tax side as well, particularly at the federal level. That's much easier to do than it is at the provincial level. It's a little bit more squeezed now than it was, given just the chaotic international environment and what's going on in the US. So, I would want to lean more heavily on the wealth tax than the corporate tax, but I think there's room to move on both, in my view.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that the biggest obstacle in front of us is the entrenched corporate and ultra wealthy machinery that is incredibly powerful. Pushing against that is really, really tough. The resources that they have at their disposal is overwhelming. It's tough for people like ourselves, organizations like we represent, to push back against that. And politicians don't seem to be supportive at this point in time. But anyways, that's the reason for this conversation today, is to try to a little bit of an encouragement, put a little bit of meat on the bones of the problem, and talk about realistic solutions that are out there. But okay, so anyways, that wraps it up. I was going to ask you guys, why do governments not default to a more equitable distribution of wealth? Has anybody got any answers on that quickly? Because we are running behind schedule.
I can comment on that quickly. I mean, I think that most Western governments, right, all kind of subscribe to this very powerful myth, the myth of the neoliberal era, right? That politics and economics are separate, right? And that the government's role is to stay out of the way, right? That markets are subject
Mhm.
to their own laws and that'll produce the optimal society. And so I think governments don't even think normally like that they have power over the distribution of wealth, right? It's never we never talk about the distribution of wealth or income as a goal, a policy goal, right? As something that governments should actually strive to change, right? Um, but I mean, we're seeing right now Carney's Davos speech that this kind of the myth of the past of the neoliberal era is starting to crack. And so I think we really have an opportunity right now to point out that, our economy is entirely constructed by the state, right? All the laws that allow people to accrue this much wealth were constructed by the state, and we could change them, right? And the state could change them, but it's going to require people to get organized and to push, right? They're not going to do it on their own. So we're going to need to organize. Labor is going to need to be organized, right? Civil society organizations are all going to have to be pushing together if we want to change government policies around this issue.
Okay, boy, that was well said, Silas. Thank you very much. I think that really summarized, the reasons that, or at least the barriers that are in front of us. There is that established a divide between the economy and the government, and that I think we have to somehow break down that barrier. We did it back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. We can do it again. Okay, so that's gonna wrap it up here. I just Yeah, that wraps up the forum. We're gonna move on to a Q&A. Sorry, we don't have a heck of a lot of time left, but if you could post your questions in the chat, that would be great. Before we get to that, I just want to thank the panelists that have joined us today. Through their contribution, we've gained a much better understanding of wealth inequality issue. I invite you to follow their work. BC Policy Solutions can be found at bcpolicy.ca. Canadians for Tax Fairness can be found at taxfairness.ca. Patriotic Millionaires Canada can be found at patrioticmillionaires.ca. Maybe, Gary, you can post those web addresses in the chat. The unbridled free market economic model embraced by the Western world for the past 45 years has failed catastrophically. Wealth inequality continues to climb. Social programs are crumbling, and democracy is breaking down. When this happens, frustrated citizens often seek radical solutions. It doesn't have to be this way. There are solutions. We can build a better Canada for the many, not the money be the change. With that, we'll move into the Q&A. Gary, have we got any questions in your inbox there?
Yeah, we do. Pat, you can hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, comments and questions. First one is Susan Crowley. Crowley has asked a question. The Canadian 2025 budget represents a plan to funnel taxpayer money up to big extractive industries, exacerbating the affordability problem. How can this course be changed, and is it relevant to this topic?
Yeah, who is familiar with the budget? Does anybody want to take a go at that, Silas? You want to? Yeah.
I can start. I'm sure Alex has some thoughts too, but yeah, I think mostly you're right. I mean, one of the signature small but kind of ridiculous policies was of course the reversal of the luxury tax on yachts and private jets that we got in budget 2025. So there was a clear giveaway of some tens of millions of dollars to the ultra wealthy. But we also have Carney's signaling plans to put a lot of public money behind new pipelines. And this gets to again the sovereignty angle, right? Did a report this past year that a lot of our oil and gas industry is owned by the U.S. and other foreign investment managers these days, right? So when we're choosing where to funnel public money in terms of which industries to subsidize and stuff like that, right? We want to, when we have that power, we should use it to make sure that we're investing in industries that are going to employ Canadians and where the profits are going to be reinvested in Canada and not just sucked away out of the country. So in terms of how course can be changed, I mean, we're going to need, again, a political movement, right? I think this Carney government has shown its colors pretty clearly in the first year here and is not trying to kind of hang on to the neoliberal era. And so I think we're going to need to have some significant organizing done to in the future elect some politicians who have a different vision for Canada.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Unfortunately, we seem to have government after government that doesn't have a problem subsidizing large foreign corporations. I mean, we see it here in British Columbia quite extensively with our LNG projects that are unfolding up in the northwest corner of the province, and all of the profits there, they do exit the country because you take LNG Canada. It is a consortium of 5 foreign companies, and some of them are actually state-owned companies, and yet the profits from that operation are all going to leave the province. And again, I don't think it has to be this way. There are countries around the world that are doing things differently. They keep the profits within their country, within their state, within their province to benefit the citizens, and we can do the same here if we want to. Gary, next question.
It's more of a comment from Sarah Sanford. Thanks so much for this excellent discussion. I really appreciate the perspectives from different positions, research, policy, lived experience, etc. She also makes a comment in chat where she's referring to some anthropological research that has been done that you may want to check in the chat if you're interested in following up on that. Do have a question/comment from Jocelyn. Unless I am mistaken, when a Canadian taxpayer dies, there is a presumption in the Canadian Income Tax Act that deems all their assets to be disposed of at the fair market value. This seems to be the equivalent of an inheritance tax found in other G7 countries, but maybe I'm wrong. Any comment or question on that?
Go ahead, Silas.
No, go for it, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, so this comes up sometimes, this deemed disposition or deemed realization of capital gains on death. So this is not equivalent to an inheritance tax. They're sometimes conflated. This is just paying the capital gains tax that you would owe anyway on the sale of an asset. It just is triggered at death under deemed disposition. But where this differs from an inheritance tax is one, it's only a tax on the gains, not on the assets or wealth, which is what an inheritance tax would be doing. And again, as we've mentioned a few times, that capital gains tax inclusion rate, that income's being taxed at half the rate of normal income as well. So, it looks a little bit like an inheritance tax, but it's not really one.
Yeah. Oh, okay, Gary, anything else?
Yeah, we got a couple more. John Calvert has said a major problem we need to address is the so-called tax competition among provinces. One of the challenges is that provinces tend to want to keep their tax rates comparable to the rates in other provinces. He does make other comments, but that's the essence of his question.
I can just say a quick word on that. I mean, I would love to see, a province like British Columbia be a leader, but any province could do this, and help open up tax space for other provinces by saying, yeah, actually, we're gonna push a little further when it comes to top income tax rates, or we're gonna tick up that corporate tax rate a bit, so that under that dynamic that John's talking about, other provinces, see that as an opportunity where they can, there's a lot of hunger for revenue out there among the provinces right now. So I think that would be really helpful. It is a genuine, tax competition between provinces is a genuine dynamic. So if you go wildly out of line with other provinces, it's quite easy to move money around the country. That is a real thing, but there is room to push, and we need provinces to either coordinate or be leaders as individuals to open more space. And it's just another reason why, our best options for taxing extreme wealth are at the federal level as well, but there is things we can do provincially.
Yeah, this sounds like a race to the bottom, which we see far too often, and jurisdiction after jurisdiction gets into a competition, get it with themselves, and at the end of the day, nobody really wins, but it's a tough one to sort out. Yeah, Gary, anything else?
Yeah, I have a question myself, if I could, please. I would like to know what the panel thinks is why do you think people try to accumulate extreme wealth? And is there not a way to define when enough is enough? Who's doing that?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, there's psychology in that one, and I'm certainly not in a position to answer it. But does anybody want to take a stab at that? That's a tough one. Um, Anybody?
Well, I'll just jump in and say you might be interested in a book called Limitarianism. The author is Ingrid Robins, and I can throw the title in the chat. But she's addressing the exact question you're answering in an attempt to define what's enough.
Would it be everybody has their own, probably has their own level? Or
No, if I remember correctly, it's 10 million, and she doesn't define a currency. She's like, kind of wherever you are, it's 10 million. But she, more importantly, she goes into why that's the number she's come up with. And I think that's the interesting part of the book.
Right. No, I think we also reach a point where it becomes probably more of a game where um, the need to accumulate more just kind of feeds on itself, becomes a bit of a monster. Silas, it looks like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think this is really important to think about, and I think it's a really deep seated kind of cultural phenomenon, right? I think like we have this desire to self-improve, to accumulate, is something that we aspire to and promote, and we might not always even realize it, right? But we tend to, put wealthy people on a pedestal and talk about, how great they are, how much they achieved and stuff like that, right? So I think we have this really deep cultural, admiration for wealth and accumulation, and we need to think about how we can change that culture, and I think that is something that needs to be part of this, to prevent this from happening. But it's not just a cultural thing, right? It's been instituted in institutions like shareholder primacy and stuff like that, right? Where we have laws that say it is the duty of corporations to help accumulate as much wealth as possible for our shareholders, right? Like that is in the law in one way or another, right? And so we need to change those policies, but we need to also tackle the kind of underlying culture that led to those being instituted, I think.
Yeah, and I don't think we can ignore the power that comes with wealth. I think a lot of wealthy people probably see that as a goal. If they can achieve a certain amount of wealth, it'll give them a certain amount of influence. And we're seeing this playing out in real time down in the United States right now. Certainly the oligarchy are flexing their muscles down there like never before. Gary, we got anything else there?
No, I think I'll wrap it up and just say that there's quite a number of comments that come in. I'd like to leave the last 5 minutes for you to wrap things up, Pat. I appreciate everybody chipping in and making a contribution, and thanks to the panel for everything that you've done and said and spoken about today. It's really been informative. A lot of people have said that. I'm not just. I think my own comment. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks, Silas, Alex, Emma. Really appreciated your participation here today. I'll take a look at this when it gets edited, and hopefully we have a quality product that we can post on YouTube and can be accessed by other people that want to learn more about the problem that we have with wealth inequality and some of the solutions. I think we've done a pretty good job of presenting that here today. And yeah, again, thanks very much. We're under time here. That's good. We'll let it go there then. Shall we wrap it up?
Thanks for having us, Pat.
Thanks,
Pardon me?
everyone.
Thanks for a great discussion, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to see everybody. Good to chat. I'm sure our paths will cross again in the future. Okay. Bye now.